The desert does not announce its heat with drama. It arrives quietly, at dawn, as pale gold light climbs over sand the color of old bone, and by mid-morning, the whole horizon seems to shimmer, as if the earth itself were breathing something visible. Somewhere south of the Mediterranean coastline, a wind rises out of the interior. Libyans call it the Ghibli, hot, dry, laced with sand, and moving fast enough to change the temperature of a whole town within a single afternoon. For 90 years, one small patch of ground here carried the reputation of being the hottest place ever measured on the surface of the earth. It no longer holds that title officially. Meteorologists later found the 1922 reading unreliable, and the record moved to Death Valley. But the number was never really the point. The feeling was. Because this is a country where heat is not a season. It is a condition of life, negotiated every single day by more than 7 million people who have built homes, kitchens, marketplaces, and entire underground cities to survive it. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who likes discovering how people actually live in the world's most extreme corners, this channel is exactly the place for you. Hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from tonight. Because today, we're going somewhere very few outsiders ever see. We're going to Libya. Not the Libya of headlines. The Libya of bread rising in clay ovens, of tea poured 3 times over an afternoon, of a desert oasis where houses were built into the earth itself centuries before air conditioning existed. This is what it actually means to live where the sun rules everything. Let's start with geography, because Libya's shape on a map explains almost everything about how life here is organized. It is enormous, the 4th largest country in Africa, larger than Alaska, and yet almost none of it is habitable in any conventional sense. More than 90% of Libya is desert, part of the vast Sahara that swallows the country's interior almost entirely, leaving a narrow ribbon of livable land pressed against the Mediterranean coast in the north. Everything that defines Libyan life clings to that ribbon. Historically, Libyans think of their country not as one place, but 3. In the northwest is Tripolitania, centered on the capital, Tripoli, a green and relatively fertile coastal plain called the Jifara, rising gradually toward mountain escarpments known as the Jabal. In the northeast is Cyrenaica, centered on the port city of Benghazi, where a limestone plateau called the Jabal al-Akhdar, the Green Mountain, rises from the coast and actually receives enough rainfall to support pine, juniper, and wild olive trees, a genuine surprise to anyone picturing Libya as pure sand. Between these 2 coastal cores lies the Sirte Desert, a stretch of true wilderness that has long separated Tripolitania from Cyrenaica, both geographically and, at times, politically. And to the south lies Fezzan, a vast desert region of scattered oases, sand seas, and ancient caravan routes administered from the town of Saba. These regions were separate provinces under Ottoman and Italian rule, and to this day, a Libyan is as likely to describe themselves by region, Tripolitanian, Cyrenaican, Fezzani, as by nationality alone. That regional identity will matter again later because it explains far more about modern Libya than any map possibly could. Along the coast itself, the ribbon of habitation is dotted with cities that each carry their own character. Tripoli, the largest, is a dense port capital built around an old medina of narrow lanes and Ottoman and Italian-era buildings. Misrata, further east, has become known as something of a trade hub, with a busy harbor and a reputation for entrepreneurial energy, even amid the country's difficulties. Benghazi, Libya's 2nd city, has functioned at various points almost like a secondary capital, home to institutions that rival Tripoli's own. Between and around these cities, the land climbs and falls in the kind of severe dramatic terrain you don't expect from a country so associated with flat sand. The Nafusa Plateau rises inland from Tripoli, home to Amazigh, Berber, hill towns built of stone, their granaries carved into cliffs to keep grain cool and safe. Further inland still, the Sahara takes over completely. Not the gentle rolling dunes of postcard imagination, but a landscape of sand seas, black volcanic plains, and rock formations that look almost lunar. There are no permanent rivers anywhere in the country. Water moves through wadis, dry riverbeds that fill briefly and violently after rare storms, then vanish again for months or years. And then there is Ghadames, roughly 600 kilometers southwest of Tripoli, right where Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia meet. It is one of the oldest pre-Saharan cities on Earth, and its old town is a UNESCO World Heritage Site for a very specific reason. It is essentially a masterclass in surviving extreme heat without a single machine. Houses were built with thick, light-colored earthen walls, covered alleyways that stay shaded and cool even at the peak of summer, and rooftop terraces reserved for women to move between homes above the heat of the streets below. The design was not decorative. It was quite literally climate engineering, developed centuries before anyone had a word for it. Climate here follows the coast-to-desert gradient you would expect. Along the Mediterranean, summers are hot but tempered by sea air, with daytime highs commonly in the 40s Celsius. Move inland, and that moderation disappears fast. Towns like Ghadames or Saba regularly see summer temperatures that would be considered emergencies almost anywhere else in the world, and they experience them for months, not days. Winters, by contrast, can be genuinely mild and even chilly at night, especially at altitude, a detail that surprises people who assume Libya is uniformly permanently hot. It is not. It is a country of extremes stacked directly against each other. A green mountain a few hundred kilometers from a sand sea, a Mediterranean breeze giving way within a single day's drive to some of the most punishing heat found anywhere on the planet. Rainfall tells the same story from a different angle. Averaged across the whole country, Libya receives only a tiny amount of rain each year, and almost all of it falls in that narrow coastal strip and on the northern slopes of the Jabal al-Akhdar, leaving the vast desert interior essentially rainless for years at a stretch. That scarcity shapes everything downstream of it, from what crops can survive to where people are able to settle at all. Olive trees, dates, and barley dominate agriculture precisely because they tolerate drought better than almost anything else, while orchards and market gardens cluster tightly around the handful of places where underground water can still be reached. So, how do you actually build a daily life around that kind of climate? The answer in Libya starts with rhythm. The day is quietly restructured around avoiding the worst of the sun. Mornings begin early, often before the heat fully sets in. Breakfast tends to be simple: bread, olive oil. Libya produces a lot of it, thanks to those Mediterranean-facing slopes. Maybe eggs cooked into a version of shakshuka, spicier and heartier here than versions found further east. On Fridays specifically, the day carries a different weight entirely. It is the start of the weekend, and after morning prayers, families gather for the week's most significant meal, almost always built around one of two dishes: couscous or bazin. Couscous, hand-rolled from semolina and steamed over a simmering stew of lamb, chicken, or fish, is the closest thing Libya has to a national dish, and the ritual around it matters as much as the food itself. It is served on one large communal platter, the couscous piled high, meat and vegetables arranged on top, sauce poured over everything, and the whole family eats from that single dish together. a detail that comes up again and again when Libyans describe what food actually means to them. It is not really about the meal, it is about who you are sharing it with. Bazan is the other anchor of Libyan cooking, and it is a dish that tells you a lot about a country used to scarcity and heat. It is an unleavened dough made from barley flour, boiled and then beaten, traditionally with a special stick called a magraf, until it forms a dense, smooth mound. It is served with a spicy tomato-based stew, boiled eggs, and meat, and eaten by hand, torn from the mound and dipped into the sauce. Barley thrives where wheat struggles, in dry, marginal land that gets less rainfall than almost any cereal crop can tolerate, which is exactly why it became a staple here centuries ago. Bazan is not just a recipe, it is a direct response to a difficult climate still sitting on the table today. Then there is tea and coffee, cardamom-scented, poured into small cups. The ritual of serving guests tea multiple times over the course of a visit, sometimes progressively sweeter with each round, is one of the most consistent threads across Libyan social life, from Tripoli apartments to tents in the deep desert. Sidewalk cafes fill up in the evenings once the day's heat finally breaks, with men gathering over coffee and conversation. Because alcohol is prohibited under Islam, these cafes function as the country's real social infrastructure. There are no bars, no nightclubs, but there is an entire culture built around slow, unhurried tea and quiet company. Markets add another layer to the rhythm of the day. In Tripoli's old Medina, narrow covered souks sell spices, olives, dates, and fresh bread, alongside gold jewelry and woven textiles, much as they have for generations, even as the wider country has changed dramatically around them. Shopping tends to happen in the cooler hours, early morning or after sunset, when the alleys fill with people again, and the heat of the day finally lets go of the streets. Housing reflects the climate just as directly as food does. In the older parts of coastal cities like Tripoli, homes are built around a central courtyard, a design borrowed and adapted across centuries of Mediterranean and Islamic architecture, with thick walls, small exterior windows, and rooms arranged to trap cool air and block direct sun. Newer construction, especially from the oil boom decades of the 20th century onward, leans more toward concrete apartment blocks, which are cheaper and faster to build, but far less naturally suited to the climate, meaning air conditioning has shifted from a luxury to something close to a basic necessity for anyone who can afford to run it. And running it, as we will get into later, is not always guaranteed. Clothing follows the same logic as the architecture, practical adaptation rather than mere custom. Loose, breathable fabrics in light colors dominate daily wardrobes, precisely because they reflect rather than absorb the sun's heat, and modest dress, common across genders in line with local religious and cultural norms, doubles as genuine sun protection in a climate where exposed skin is a liability, not a convenience. In the Deep South, Tuareg men are still recognized by their distinctive indigo veils, wrapped and rewrapped throughout the day for both cultural and practical reasons, shielding the face from blowing sand as much as from sun. Family life in Libya remains deeply intergenerational. Multiple generations often share a home or live within very close reach of each other, and there is a strong cultural emphasis on caring for elderly relatives within the family rather than through outside institutions. Friday afternoons after the big midday meal are typically spent visiting relatives, drinking that endless tea, and simply being present with each other, not filling the time with activity so much as making space for it. And the heat itself never really leaves the daily calculation. Errands get planned around it, mornings and evenings for anything outdoors, the middle of the day reserved for staying inside, shutters closed, waiting it out. In the deep south, in towns like Gadams or Saba, this is not a lifestyle choice. It is survival logic, refined over roughly 1,000 years of living in one of the driest, hottest inhabited regions on the planet. And it still shapes how a day unfolds now in 2026, as much as it did centuries ago. If there is one idea that threads through almost every part of Libyan life, it is generosity, what is known in Arabic as karam. It shows up in the smallest interactions. A stranger insisting you share a meal, a shopkeeper waving off payment for something small, a family setting an extra place at the table without being asked, just in case someone arrives. Hospitality here is not treated as a nice gesture. It is described generation after generation as a matter of honor, something close to an obligation, rooted in centuries of desert tradition where offering food and shelter to a traveler could genuinely mean the difference between life and death. That history is gone, but the instinct it created never really left. Libya's cultural identity is layered in a way that surprises people who expect a single, uniform Arab desert culture. Ethnically and linguistically, most Libyans are Arab or of mixed Arab-Berber descent, and Arabic is overwhelmingly the language of daily life. But Libya is also home to a genuine Amazigh, Berber population, concentrated in towns like Zuwara on the coast and across the Nafusa mountain villages, where the Tamazight language and its distinct Tifinagh script are still spoken and taught, following decades in which the previous government actively suppressed them. Further south, in the Fezzan, Tuareg communities maintain a Saharan nomadic heritage that connects Libya to Niger, Mali, and Algeria, as much as to the Mediterranean world. And in the southeast, the Tubu people add yet another distinct thread to the country's ethnic fabric. Libya, in other words, is not one culture wearing one face. It is a coastline of Mediterranean influence layered over a desert interior of older, deeper roots. That layering shows up dramatically in the architecture and ruins scattered across the country. Along the coast, Leptis Magna stands as one of the best preserved Roman cities anywhere in the Mediterranean world, a genuinely staggering sight, with its forum, amphitheater, and market columns still largely intact, expanded under the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus, who was born there. Not far away, the ruins of Sabratha sit almost directly on the seafront, waves visible behind excavated temples and baths. These are not minor archaeological footnotes. They are among the most complete Roman remains left standing anywhere on Earth, in part because Libya's isolation over the past century has kept the mass tourism and the erosion that comes with it largely away. Italy's more recent imprint shows up too. Colonial rule from 1911 to 1951 left its own mark in Tripoli's old clock tower, in certain neoclassical government buildings, and in a genuinely surprising local love of good espresso, still visible in coffee culture today. Religiously, Libya is overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim, and Islam shapes the rhythm of daily and public life in visible, structural ways. The call to prayer marking the day into segments, Friday anchoring the week, Ramadan reshaping eating and working patterns for a full month each year, when the evening meal, iftar, often opens with a warming soup called shorba, spiced with cinnamon and dried mint, before the family sits down to something larger. National holidays like Independence Day sit alongside religious celebrations such as Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, both marked with new clothes, shared sweets, and long visits between extended family, weaving civic pride and religious tradition into the same yearly rhythm. What ties all of this together? The ethnic layering, the ruins, the religion, the food, is a sense of identity built on continuity despite disruption. Libyans have lived through Ottoman rule, Italian colonization, a monarchy, decades of Gaddafi's idiosyncratic rule, and now more than a decade of political fracture since 2011. Through nearly all of it, the core social unit, family, tribe, hospitality, the shared meal, has remained remarkably intact. It is tempting, watching from outside, to define a country by its politics. Libyans, when you actually talk to them, tend to define themselves by something older and steadier than that. If a documentary like this makes you want to see more of the world's overlooked corners, the places most travel content skips entirely, go ahead and subscribe now, because there is a lot more of this coming, and you will not want to miss the next one. Because up next, we need to talk honestly about the part of Libyan life that does not show up in a hospitality story. The part that makes living in Libya a genuinely complicated question to answer. Here is the truth that has to sit right alongside everything we have just described. Libya, as of 2026, is not a stable country, and pretending otherwise would do a disservice to the millions of people navigating that instability every single day. Since the 2011 uprising that ended Muammar Gaddafi's 4-decade rule, Libya has never fully reunified. Today, the country is effectively split between two rival governments. The Tripoli-based Government of National Unity, internationally recognized and backed largely by Western Libya and Turkey, controls the northwest. An Eastern-based administration, the Government of National Stability, operates out of Benghazi and Tobruk, backed by the House of Representatives and the Libyan National Army under General Khalifa Haftar, with support from other regional and international powers. Repeated attempts at national elections, first promised back in 2021, have been postponed again and again, and as of mid-2026, both sides remain locked in a political stalemate over how to reunify institutions and finally hold a vote. It is not active, frontline warfare most of the time, but it is also not resolved, and localized clashes between armed groups still occur. That fracture bleeds directly into daily economic life. Libya sits on some of the largest proven oil reserves in Africa, and oil and gas revenue makes up the overwhelming majority of government income. On paper, that should mean prosperity. In practice, competing governments, competing spending, and a lack of unified budget oversight have created serious distortions. The Libyan dinar has been devalued more than once in the past 2 years alone, most recently in early 2026, as the central bank tries to close the gap between the official exchange rate and a persistent black market rate. Inflation, heavy subsidies on fuel and electricity, and a public wage bill that consumes an enormous share of government spending have all combined to squeeze ordinary households, even as oil production climbs toward decade highs. Youth unemployment sits above 50%, one of the starkest numbers in the entire region, meaning a huge share of Libya's young population is either underemployed, working informally, or leaving the country entirely in search of opportunity. Then there is the infrastructure strain that heat makes so much worse. Power cuts have been a recurring feature of Libyan life for over a decade now, worsening specifically in summer when air conditioning demand spikes and a national grid still carrying damage from years of conflict and chronic underinvestment simply cannot keep up. In some neighborhoods, outages stretch for hours at a time during the hottest months, and households that can afford it rely on private generators, filling city streets with their hum and diesel exhaust in the evenings. For a country already defined by extreme heat, losing air conditioning for hours on end is not an inconvenience. It is a genuine daily hardship, one more layer stacked on top of everything else. Libya's instability has also made it one of the primary transit points for migration across the Mediterranean, with hundreds of thousands of migrants and refugees, largely from other parts of Africa, currently present in the country, concentrated around Tripoli, Benghazi, and Misrata, often living in precarious and unregulated conditions while attempting to reach Europe. It is a humanitarian pressure that sits alongside and often gets lost behind Libya's other struggles. Access to basic services tells a similarly mixed story. Surveys in recent years show most Libyan households connected to electricity and formal education, and school attendance rates remain relatively high at the primary and secondary level. But those numbers hide real gaps underneath them. Only a minority of households have consistent access to safely managed drinking water, and a meaningful share of young children show signs of stunted growth in certain regions, a marker of nutritional strain that tends to track closely with a family's distance from the wealthier coastal cities. Public health care, similarly, is available on paper nearly everywhere, but its actual quality varies enormously between a well-resourced Tripoli hospital and a clinic in a smaller Fezzan town, where equipment, staffing, and even reliable electricity for basic procedures can be far harder to guarantee. And then there is the honest question of safety for outsiders specifically. As of 2026, most Western governments, including the United States, maintain their highest-level travel advisory for Libya, citing crime, terrorism, kidnapping risk, unexploded landmines left over from years of conflict, and the unpredictability of militia-controlled checkpoints. The UK's Foreign Office has eased its guidance somewhat for a handful of cities, including Tripoli, Benghazi, and Misrata, reflecting a genuinely improving, though still fragile, security picture in those specific areas. A small number of specialist tour operators do now run organized trips to sites like Leptis Magna and Gadam's without incident, which tells you something real about how localized and manageable some of the risk has become under careful, guided circumstances. But independent, casual travel remains a very different proposition from organized tourism, and for now, most governments still advise against it almost everywhere in the country. None of this cancels out what we described earlier: the warmth, the food, the hospitality, the extraordinary resilience of ordinary Libyan life carrying on despite all of it. But an honest documentary has to hold both of those truths at once. A genuinely warm, deeply rooted culture, functioning inside one of the more difficult political and economic situations in North Africa. That combination, resilience without romanticizing the hardship, might be the single most defining feature of what it actually means to live in Libya right now. So, could you actually live here? It is worth asking honestly, the way we do with every country on this channel, because the answer says less about Libya and more about what you are actually looking for. If what you want is comfort, predictability, reliable infrastructure, and an easy travel process, Libya, as it stands in 2026, is not that place, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. The political division is real. The power cuts are real. The economic distortion, the safety advisories, the difficulty of entry for most foreigners, all of it is real, and none of it is going away quickly. But if what draws you to a place like this is something else, the pull of somewhere genuinely unshaped by mass tourism, somewhere Roman ruins sit nearly empty against the Mediterranean, because almost no one comes to see them. Somewhere, an entire ancient city was engineered, centuries before electricity, purely to defeat the heat. Then Libya offers something vanishingly rare on a planet where almost everywhere else has already been discovered, photographed, and packaged: There is a particular kind of quiet that exists in a place the modern world has, for complicated reasons mostly passed over. Whether that is a tragedy or a strange kind of preservation probably depends on who you ask. What stays with you most, thinking back over everything Libya actually is not the heat record it once held and then lost. It is the Ghibli wind rising over the sand in the late afternoon. It is a family gathered around one shared plate of couscous on a Friday, eating with their hands from the same dish because that closeness is the entire point. It is a stranger who barely knows you, insisting you stay for tea, then insisting again because refusing a third time would be its own kind of rudeness in a culture built on that instinct. It is a mud-walled city in the middle of the Sahara, engineered by people who understood extreme heat better than most modern architects ever will, built without a single machine, and still standing today. Libya is not an easy country to sum up in one sentence, and honestly, if this documentary tried to give you one, it would be lying to you. It is a place holding genuine warmth and genuine hardship in the same hand at the same time, the way a lot of complicated places do. It is a country whose people have kept their sense of hospitality, family, and identity intact through a monarchy, a dictatorship, a revolution, and over a decade of division. Not because it was easy, but because, for them, it was never really optional. That kind of resilience deserves to be seen clearly, without exaggeration in either direction, not flattened into either a warning or a postcard. If this journey into Libya gave you a clearer, more honest picture than you had before, one shaped by research instead of headlines, that is exactly what this channel exists to do, and there is a lot more of the world left to cover this way. Subscribe if you want to come along for the next one. And before you go, tell me down in the comments, after everything you just heard, would you ever actually go?